And so this uh, idea of God as present, as loving, as the dearest of parents, is precisely what what is the first experience, you might say, or some people are a little slow in getting to this point, is going to happen in most people who do the prayer regularly in the course of the first few weeks, months, or it might, for some reason, which God alone knows, it may be better for us not to have that feeling right away. But it usually comes then better than ever. And while everybody else is enjoying the first fruits of centering prayer, you may be wondering what the hell is, what they're talking about. But just wait a year, and then if you're in a prayer group, they start moaning and bemoaning that God has forgotten them and left them. Meanwhile, you're in the lap of this incredible affection that you've been waiting for a year, and you don't know what they're talking about now. So everybody, God adjusts himself to each of us, and this you can be sure of. Whatever you need, you'll get. So if you've suffered rejection, you're likely to get the most consolation during the first year of a practice like centering prayer. And this is also why we shouldn't be stuck up or something because we have a lot of spiritual consolation. Some people have more than others. The reason some people, maybe even the saints, had these wonderful mystical experiences that they usually were told by their confessor to write about, it's not because they're better than we are. They were in tougher shape than we are. And so they needed more consolation or more reassurance. So for all we know, you might as well feel sorry for them rather than envy them. Now, I've been at this journey a long time and still haven't made much progress, as you can see. But I have outgrown certain attitudes that I now recognize were a little childish or immature in my spiritual life. So I no longer look for any consolation. I would be kind of embarrassed if I had it and to say, oh, this is a distraction. And it really is. At some point, any experience is not as close as a communion with God as no experience at all. Now, this is bad news, maybe for some of you. But my question is, well, then why are you in this journey? Is it for yourself, or is it for God? And if it's for God, then whatever you receive psychologically, you trust God that this is what you need psychologically, but on the level of reality, you know that in secret, God is giving you everything you need and more than you need and greater gifts than if you experienced them. Now, this is a hard thing to understand right away. But what freedom you'd have, folks, if you had no expectations of spiritual consolation or reassurance, and just assume that God is giving you everything you need moment by moment, and that every moment has within it everything you need to be completely happy. God is reality. God is reality. If that's true, since you're usually in contact with reality, I presume, even if you're in a mental institution with all kinds of illusions, at least you're in the institution, and that's reality. So you can never get away from God. No place to go, because God is already here. Again, we say in theology, God is infinite. Have you heard this saying? infinite, meaning isness without any limitation whatsoever. The famous saying that God gave of his name to Moses, remember, it was I am. And it said twice. Instead of saying, I am Thomas, he said, I am, I am. So I am is God's name. And how did he get there? By being I am. So it means isness in every direction, up, down, or no direction. Wherever you go, God is there. God is beyond being and beyond non-being. He's both personal and impersonal. There's no gender in God because God is total unity. But at the same time, and this is why it's impossible to grasp who God really is, God is also infinite diversity and infinite possibility at the same time. In our case, we experience diversity as divisive under most circumstances. We're experiencing that now in the global attitudes of religions and belief systems and nationalities throughout the world. Diversity means boundaries, protection, defenses, and all the other things that preoccupy people. But in actual fact, where there is unity, diversity becomes complementarity. And it's no longer divisive, but enriching. And this is the insight that is missing in the human family now, and in the process of globalization that seems to be happening whether we like it or not. But as Christians and as contemplatives, the energy that you are receiving from God is more powerful than all the negativity in the world. So as you grow in your spiritual journey, everybody is growing. You can't help but affect everything in the universe, moment by moment, by your activities or even by your thoughts. And if this sounds a little mystical, it is backed up now by astrophysics or quantum mechanics theory, in which it's proven now that at least it's asserted by cutting-edge physicists, that you can't have a thought without affecting everything else in the universe instantaneously. Again, the living cell is so constructed that it's basically the same in every living thing. So between us and a mouse, as far as your cells go, there's not much difference. A couple of extra genes in there somewhere, maybe, but not much. The difference between races or colors of people is so infinitesimal, it's absolutely ridiculous to make any division based on color or ethnicity or some such things. In other words, it's our wrong ideas of people or reality, or based on our need to be defensive. Sometimes reasonable defenses are in order because the human family as a whole emphasizes its diversity, hence its divisiveness, without its unity, which would transform divisiveness into a common feeling of accountability for everyone on earth, and indeed everyone who ever lived or will live. We have a oneness with them that is part of the reality of the universe that we can't change, but we can deny to our great misfortune as individuals, but also as a family, as a human race. Now, it seems from the gospel that the invitation to be transformed is extended to everyone on earth, no exception. The parables are so clear. In the great banquet, for instance, which all exegetes recognize as a symbol of who gets into heaven or who enters the kingdom of God, The householder, remember, first invites his peers, and they decline. Then, because the household is not filled, he invites the poor and the lame and the maimed, whom the prophets of Israel foresaw were God's favorites. The hero of the Psalms, for instance, is obviously the one afflicted or suffers poverty in some form, mental, spiritual, or physical. This is God, the apple of God's eye, as the Psalm says, is those in need. So the greater the need, the greater the love that God wants to give. Well, in this situation, then, the future is right now, and all that God has to give us that can possibly be communicated, short of the transformation that takes place after death. In other words, the last veil between us and God is the body, and when that passes away, then the reality of God's presence becomes all-pervasive, all-delightful, and eternally present, since in the next life there is no time as we understand it. Everything is now. And thus, this movement of into the presence of God is crucial for our own well-being, but not just for ourselves. As soon as you seek the kingdom primarily for yourself, you're on the wrong road, because the kingdom is not just for you and I, and unless everyone else is saved too, you can't be perfectly happy. That's the mystery of the unity of the human family that has not been fully understood or preached up till now. But it sure is present in the gospel, and you just have to concentrate on it a bit. One of the things that Paul says, for instance, is that as the spiritual journey grows within us and the fruits of the Spirit manifest themselves spontaneously, charity, joy, peace, gentleness, self-control, patience in the others, these are things that appear without effort. They're the normal releasing of the divine energies that we received in baptism, but perhaps may have received at the moment of birth. We don't really know. Baptism is a commitment to accept the invitation that is extended in the gospel. But that extension is extended to all the human family as a kind of remote call to divine union, symbolized by the coming of the Magi in the infancy narrative. These were people who were not Jews. They were not men of a religious faith that was known in Israel. Maybe they were Zoroastrians, I don't know. But in any case, they're symbols of seekers of God of all time. And they were able to find the infant in the crib, meaning that the extension of divine union is given to everybody from the beginning of time until now. One of the things that is sometimes forgotten in our religious instruction is that God didn't just create the new covenant. The new covenant suggests, of course, there was an old one. But in actual fact, there were several covenants before the old one. And these were identified by some of the great predecessors, theologically, of the Second Vatican Council. One is, there's the pre-Noah covenant that God had. Then there was the post-Noah covenant, symbolized by the rainbow, if you remember your scriptures. Then there was the covenant, apparently, with Melchizedek. Then there was the Abrahamic covenant. So God has been reaching out all through human history, and his covenants have simply been getting better and more comprehensive. But that doesn't mean that the covenant, which really means salvation, was withdrawn from the previous covenant. And so there are people in the world today, I'm sure, in primitive cultures around the world who are still in those covenants, and God is saving them through those means. And so much so that it's good to repeat this often enough, because so much of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council hasn't filtered down far enough to you folks in the pews. It needs to be repeated again and again. The church's, Catholic Church at least, position is that the Spirit is at work in all the other Christian denominations. And when you think of it, baptism is so much more important than any other kind of doctrinal difference that it's incredible and a scandal, really, that the churches are not unified. And if they were unified, it would give an enormous surge of importance to the realization throughout the human family of its basic unity. The marvelous teaching now of the churches. Oh, I felt so good when they, I had a grandma who was not a Catholic. My mother was not a Catholic. Oh, it was such a wonderful relief to realize, and I was brought up in non-Catholic schools, that my friends and buddies were not going to hell after all. What a relief. I worried about Grandma. I worried about my mother. And my father, he had stopped going to church. So I can't tell you how much, as a youngster with a sensitive heart, I worried about everybody. I should have worried more about myself, I think. Be realistic. But anyway, we now can love the Protestants. Isn't that wonderful? We now can admire and love people of other religions, because the later documents from the present Holy Father suggest that grace is working in other world religions, and that some of their rituals, the Holy See is not their place to decide which ones, are salvific. They're like sacraments. This doesn't mean that all the religions are the same, but that they're, in a sense, complementary, and maybe certain religions that have come out of different cultures are necessary for the cultural conditioning of those people, at least until the world becomes thoroughly globalized and becomes one village, which may not be the best thing on earth, because diversity is very enriching. So there's a value to other religions that needs to be respected. And so this is the time then to develop our understanding of the other religions and our respect for them. And this is especially incarnated in the Algerian martyrs, who happened to be Trappists, who lived in Algeria, surrounded totally by Islamic society, who shared the poverty of their neighbors and simply bore witness, a Christian witness, a Christian presence. So what they have discovered is that missionary work is primarily to bring the presence of Christ into the culture and live identified with the local people, and to share their respect for their religion and so on. These people became martyrs because the extremists in that part of the world couldn't endure having their presence there. So this is one of the signs of the times. Many missionary orders are rethinking what their approach to the missions might be in the light of the witness of those people who laid down their lives, not so much for a cause, but to make the face of Christ visible through presence. A presence that was not out to convert the Islamic people, but simply to share their life together and be present. So what this is saying is a new understanding of what it means to go into the whole world and preach the gospel. It's been understood a certain way up until now, but now we're invited to realize that it's you who are a missionary in your inmost being in the degree that you enshrine the presence of God. And that presence doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere, but to go there is a powerful witness. But it's who you are, it's your being that invisibly is pouring positive energy into the universe, overcoming the negativity of generations of false selves, put it in that terminology, and that you have no idea of what empowerment is communicated to you in contemplative prayer, except that little by little you can't help but do good and love other people. You can't sit on divine love. It'll begin to spread, and it'll expand appropriately in your circumstances according to your vocation. And so this is the sense, I think, in which Paul says God is all in all. Come back to that idea. If God is infinite, then it means there's no room for anything else. Unless you recognize that everything, even that's created, is in God. If you recognize that you're in God, then you have the right idea. Translated into images like you're in the arms of God, that's very good. But even suffering is in God. All pain is in God. Everything that exists is somehow in God. And so there's no place to go to get away from God, but rather to accept the reality of God's presence is the greatest wisdom. And that this presence transcends any experience you can have. This is what is meant by pure faith. Pure faith believes that God is present without any human evidence at all. And this is what is the great work of the dark nights that St. John talks about. It's the purification of faith, hope, and charity. So that your faith is not dependent on other people or belief systems learned in early childhood, but rather on your certitude in God's presence without any human props or evidence to support it. Obviously, can only climb up to that degree of inner freedom slowly. But that means that as you get up and go out of here for lunch, you're not really going anywhere. You're just moving from one spot to another in God. God is the ground of your being. So whether you're asleep or awake or moving or still, always in God. And hence the psalmist says, "Be still, and you will know that I am God." This is probably the best advice that was ever offered for all time. Even Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu pundit of the last century, said, you don't need any more advice than that in the Psalms. Be still. It's thinking, dear folks, that activates our belief system. And it's out of your belief system that you work, that you act. And hence, if your action or if circumstances contradict your belief system, you're constantly experiencing emotional affliction, grief, anger, discouragement, and so on. That's why I singled out, I should do this. If you feel you should do something, then it means you're almost certainly going to fail, and the feeling arises of depression. It's just automatic. So why have the belief system that you should do anything? Do everything out of the love of God and under the movement of the Spirit, which becomes clearer and clearer as contemplative prayer grows. And in spite of tragedy or disaster, you will always be happy at some deeper level, because your wisdom tells you that everything happens according to God's universal plan. And if we can surrender ourselves to that plan freely, you'll be perfectly happy, even if you lose your life. Because our life is not an end in itself. And like the martyrs of Algeria, in losing it for the love of God, you make true life and love available for an enormous proportion of the human family. So the bottom line is, at least for our time, is accountability for everyone else. So if those of you who are on the centering prayer path and have moved into the night of sense, which happens rather soon, within a couple of years usually, for those who do the practice faithfully, you begin to see the dark side of your personality and the obstacles that the divine therapist points to in the course of your twice daily interviews in the inner room. As Jesus calls the spiritual level of our being, the level beyond thinking and beyond conversation. It's a movement from conversation to communion, from activity to receptivity. It's not an end in itself, but it prepares us for action saturated with the values of the inner room, which are peace, inner freedom, love, appropriate concern for everyone and everything. That is a certain openness and vulnerability to God's healing process. Infinite love means that God is all in all. That's a quote from Paul. Or, as he puts it in another place, Christ is everything in everyone. What that really means is that the goodness that is in each of us is God's presence in us. And our service of others is God's presence in others, so that in actual fact, although we experience ourselves as doing things, what's really happening is that God, present in us, is serving God in others, or greeting God in others, or loving God in others. And in that sense, God is all in all. And according to Jesus' revelation, God is love. St. John clarifies that even more when he says, God is love. That is to say, he doesn't just show love as we do, but is love. And so the spiritual journey is a movement to do what God does, or to become like God. And that is that our destiny is not just to show love. This is an important start. The works of mercy, concern for others, and accountability that is even willing to bear the sufferings of other people for the love of God and for love of them. But above all, it means that God is calling us to manifest his love, or to be loved the way God is. And the extraordinary nature of love, as St. John of the Cross understands divine love, is that that divine love tries to make you equal. And in other words, God isn't satisfied with just loving you. He wants us to love him back equally. And how can that be? Only if we receive the Holy Spirit and the Spirit loves in us. Where does that leave the false self? Dead as a doornail. have to let the false self go. Where does that leave the ego? Of no account whatsoever. So our over-attachment to our identity doesn't mean we become nothing at all or lose our uniqueness. It means that we finally find out who we actually are, which is, as God is, unconditional love. In other words, our life in God finally penetrates us through and through, thus making us capable of being God with God. In other words, you can only pass through the eye of a needle without the baggage of ego or any possessive attitude towards anything. Everything is at our service. As soon as you try to hang on of it, you've lost it. So it's not that anything changes except our attitude, which is to let go of our possessive attitude that ultimately is seeking happiness in something other than God. It can't work. So that as God draws us away from our over-attachments to our emotional programs for happiness, our desire for control, security, excessive security, and approval, this freedom grows to love, to love, to love, so that at some point we become aware that the secret of the universe is love. The consequence of that is that the meaning of the universe is sacrifice, because divine love is always giving itself away. That's its very nature. And so, once you've been through all the dark nights, purified your soul, which John of the Cross says is the equivalent of purgatory, the worst is still to come. We might as well be honest, because now that you're able to love, you're ready to take on, as Jesus did, the sufferings of the whole world. So I don't guarantee, for those of you approaching the transforming union, to have no more troubles. It's not a magic carpet to bliss. It's a direct route to reality. And reality is total self-sacrifice. And so to be in heaven with any selfishness is to be very uncomfortable. To let go of our over-attachments. This is the therapy. And God lovingly is always helping us. He went through this with his disciples. You see it over and over again in the gospel. Without a word of without a word of blame or recrimination, he just points the truth to them. Like Martha, why are you anxious? He doesn't say, you're really not serving me at all. You're just looking for praise in this meal. No, there's no attack. It's just the invitation to look at the truth about ourselves so that it can be healed. And this loving, healing process is only painful if you are closed in on yourself and afraid. Fear closes us in ourselves. Love opens and finds room in our heart for everyone. Everyone. And so, having reached a certain degree of love, we may be invited by God to, in the little ups and downs of every day, sufferings and concerns of daily life, these are not ours anymore. They're part of our participation in the Paschal mystery, in the salvation of the world. And so instead of being overwhelmed by our crosses, we realize that at a certain level, this is the greatest privilege we could have, because now we're doing what God does all the time, namely giving ourselves away. It's this humility of God that we're invited to participate in. A humility that, in the case of God, seems to suggest that God's desire is to cease to be God. He has everything. Why should he care? It's this infinite freedom that, and our participation in it, that enables us to be free to love and free to suffer, free to sacrifice, just to be free. And this is the movement of contemplative prayer into divine union and unity, and whatever is beyond that. Our destiny is only known by God. But as Paul says, no one has ever had the closest imagination regarding what God has in store for those who love him.